How's everyone doing tonight? Yes. My name is Marissa Reyes. I'm the Chief Learning and Engagement Officer for Crystal Bridges and the Momentary. And tonight we are here for a truly special program, and we are so excited to have you here with us today. I'd like to begin this program with our Indigenous peoples acknowledgement, recognizing the museum's role as settlers and guests in the Northwest Arkansas region. We acknowledge the Caddo, Quapaw, and Osage, as well as the many Indigenous caretakers of this land and water. We appreciate the enduring influence of the vibrant, diverse, and contemporary cultures of Indigenous peoples. We are conscious of the role in colonization that museums have played. As cultural institutions, we have a responsibility to engage in the dismantling of historical and systemic invisibility of Indigenous peoples past, present, and future. We choose to intentionally hold ourselves accountable to appropriate conversation, representation, connection, and education to facilitate a space of measurable change. This evening's program is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors and friends at Crystal Bridges. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to the following people, special people: Elizabeth and Tim Swank, Reed Greenwood, Ellen and Malcolm Hayward, Jason and Carol Vella, Jill and Tom King, Pam Kendall Rijos, Erin and Omer Torre, who are sponsoring this event in honor of Miss Fazilet Pachalolo, who is celebrating her 75th birthday today. We also thank Arkansas PBS for partnering with us to make tonight's event accessible to those joining us via live stream. Please join me in recognizing our sponsors with a warm round of applause. We are thrilled to present an extraordinary lineup of talent this evening. Our speakers include a renowned U.S. Surgeon General, an award-winning filmmaker, a world-famous cellist, and one of America's most acclaimed and beloved actors. Each has deep expertise in their field, and what makes them truly remarkable is their willingness to explore new frontiers and apply their gifts in innovative ways. You are in for an unforgettable experience. I'd like to acknowledge the vibrant and diverse partnership behind the two-day initiative, which features today's program and tomorrow's screening of Nicholas Ma's film, Leap of Faith, at the Momentary. The following organizations, One America Movement, the Stand Together Foundation, the Colossian Forum, and the Utah Film Center have joined forces to reinvigorate essential conversations about community and connection. Crystal Bridges is proud to foster creativity and dialogue, a powerful means to promote unity and shared understanding. Each partner enriches this effort. The One America Movement bridges divides. The Stand Together Foundation champions innovative grassroots solutions. The Colossian Forum transforms conflict into growth through faith and dialogue. And the Utah Film Center supports these endeavors as the fiscal sponsor for Leap of Faith. We are deeply grateful to their collaboration on this program and look forward to more such programming in the future. It is now my great honor to introduce Dr. Vivek Murthy. Dr. Murthy is a distinguished American physician and former Vice Admiral in the United States Public Health Service Commissioned Corps, having served as Surgeon General under Presidents Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. Known as America's Doctor, he has led initiatives to address our nation's pressing public health challenges, including the epidemic of isolation and loneliness. He is also the author of the New York Times bestseller, Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vivek Murthy.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you so much. I so appreciate that warm welcome. And it is a joy to be here. This is actually my very first time in Arkansas, and I'm excited to be here. I've made many trips to the neighboring state of Missouri in Springfield, where my aunt used to live, and for many years practiced medicine as an oncologist there. But this is my first time making it over the border. So thank you for the warm welcome. And I want to especially thank Alice Walton, for her incredible hospitality in inviting us here to host this event, but perhaps even more importantly, just for her vision in creating this extraordinary, beautiful space that we're in. When I saw Alice earlier today, yeah, give her a hand. When Alice and I were chatting earlier today, we were talking about health and the fact that there's a spiritual dimension to our health as well. And when we are connected to places of beauty, to nature, to each other, that nourishes our spirit. It feeds our soul. And that makes this an especially important place, a sacred space. So thank you, Alice, for creating this for all of us. You know, we are perhaps, the few of us who are going to be up here on stage in just a couple minutes, an unusual pairing. You have a doctor, you have a renowned musician, you have a documentary filmmaker. But what we all share in common is a deep commitment, a fierce commitment, to doing everything we can to rebuild community in America. And we feel so strongly about this because our world has become profoundly lonely and isolated, and it's happening before our very eyes. I first learned about the power of community from my father. He told me the most remarkable thing when I was younger. He said that the first time that he ever felt a sense of emptiness, that something was missing in his life, was when he left his small rural farming village in India. Now, I was so struck by this statement because he grew up with no running water, with no electricity. His family scarcely had enough money to put food on the table each night. But what they lacked in wealth, they made up for in community. Families in the village looked out for each other. If you went by somebody's house, they invited you in and likely gave you whatever food they had to share. When my father lost his mother when he was only 10 years old, the village stepped in to help him and his 5 siblings and his father. Friends and extended family became surrogate parents. I thought about my father's story years later when I became a doctor myself and I was practicing in the hospital. Because to my surprise, the most common affliction I saw was not diabetes or heart disease. It was loneliness. And I never learned about loneliness or isolation when I was in medical school or residency training, yet there it was all around me. And I came to see that, you know, you could eat well, you could exercise, you could sleep 8 hours a night, you could have all the right vital signs and lab tests and imaging studies. But the truth is, if you didn't feel a sense of belonging, then it was really hard to feel whole. Now, I came in the years that followed to learn that what I was seeing in the lives of my patient was so much more than just a bad feeling. But instead, the loneliness they were experiencing had profound consequences for their health. We've now come to understand that when people struggle with a sense of social disconnection, it increases their risk of depression, anxiety, and suicide. But it also increases their risk for heart disease, for dementia, for premature death. So much so that the mortality impact that we see associated with social disconnection is comparable to what we see with smoking, and is comparable to what we see with obesity. Now, I would guess that all of us in this room probably understand that smoking and obesity, these are classic public health challenges. But it turns out that our disconnection from one another is just as important a challenge when it comes to our quality and quantity of life. And the truth is, I have seen this challenge now all across America as Surgeon General. I've had the great privilege of traveling to small towns and big cities all across America, of sitting in people's living rooms and listening to them, sitting in town halls, and hearing people talk about their life, about what's good, but also what's missing. And everywhere I go, people talk about loneliness. They don't use that word, by the way, because there's a stigma associated with saying I'm lonely. A stigma I know well from growing up, when as a child I struggled a lot with loneliness, dreading to go to school each day, sometimes pretending I had a stomachache so my mother wouldn't make me go to school. She wised up after some time. But I also remember that feeling of dread walking into the cafeteria and worrying that there was going to be nobody to sit next to. And I felt a real sense of shame around being lonely, which is why, even though I knew my parents loved me so deeply, I never, ever spoke to them about this. And it was only years later, when I talked to friends from that time, that they said, when I told them how I was feeling, they said, "Oh, wait, you too?" And that's when I finally realized I wasn't alone in my loneliness. If only I had known. If only they had known back then. You know, when I traveled just over this past couple of years to college campuses across America as part of a social connection tour, a campus tour, I found something that really stunned me, which is that the dining halls on the campus were quiet. The school we went to, I asked my team, I said, "Did we get the schedule wrong? Did we come during spring break? Like, where is everyone?" And I realized, no, we were there on the right date. But in the dining hall, people weren't talking to each other anymore. They were on their devices. They had earpods in their ears. They weren't engaging with each other. I had a student at one of these events who came up to me and he said, and I'll just tell you parenthetically, that of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of events that I did as Surgeon General, there were no set of events that generated more engagement and demand than these college campus visits, because of how deeply and profoundly young people are experiencing loneliness and isolation today. And I had a student who came up to me at one of these colleges and said, "How are we supposed to connect with each other when it's no longer the culture to talk to one another anymore?" If you just think about that for a moment, I thought I misheard that question the first time he asked. But he's saying it's no longer the culture for people to talk to each other anymore. It feels like you're intruding to start a conversation, to say hello to somebody you don't know. You worry that you'll feel like you're the creepy person, right? As many people tell me. And if you don't do that time after time after time, you lose your social muscle, because it turns out our social muscle is just like any other muscle in our body. The more we use it, the stronger it gets. The less we use it, the weaker it gets, and the harder it becomes to start a conversation, to approach somebody we don't know. So as I've had these experiences around the country, I've sensed that there's a deeper unhappiness in people's lives, one that's not fully explained by economic hardship or by physical health challenges or by safety concerns. All of those are important, by the way. They contribute mightily to our well-being. But I found that even when those weren't concerns, there was still a deep unhappiness in people's lives. And that's why I spent the last 4 years in office mulling over this question: what is the root cause of that unhappiness? And I finally put together, toward the end of my term, just about a month ago, my parting prescription for America, which answered that question. I came to see that there are basically 3 essential elements that fuel our fulfillment in life that have been eroding over the years: our relationships, our engagement in service, and our sense of purpose. Relationships, service, and purpose, these are the triad of fulfillment. This is what we need to be able, on any given day in our life, and certainly at the end of our lives, to feel like we led a good life. And each of these, it turns out, can significantly impact our physical and mental health. These can reduce, each of these, our risk for heart disease, for depression, for anxiety, for premature death. But they also allow us to connect with something that's bigger than ourselves, which is something we so desperately need as human beings. All 3 drivers, though, of fulfillment, relationship, service, and purpose, have been diminishing in our lives. 1/3 of adults in our country right now struggle with loneliness, and about 1/2 of young people struggle with loneliness as well. The majority of our country is not engaged in formal and informal acts of service. And a majority of young adults say that they have little or no sense of purpose or meaning in their lives. As a father, when I came across this data, it really stunned me. It was painful to hear. I think for those of you who are, how many of you, actually, just by show of hands, how many people here have children in your life? They could be your kids, nieces and nephews, friends' children, grandkids. Right? Almost all of us have children in our life that we care about. And what we want for those kids, regardless of what profession they may choose, where they may live in the country, we want them to be healthy, happy, and fulfilled. And to see in the data and in the stories that I encountered all across America that so many did not feel that way was heartbreaking. But perhaps one of the reasons for this is because so many of the messages coming at us are telling us to prioritize a different triad, not the triad of fulfillment, but the triad of success, modern day success, which is rooted in fame, wealth, and power. The reason I came to understand this, it's because this is what young people told me all across the country. When I traveled, I would often ask them a consistent question, which is, how do you define success? And what I was really asking them is, how does society define success for you? And they told me some combination of fame, wealth, and power. Now, they weren't always happy about that, by the way. Many of them suspected that that may not make them happy. Many of them knew people in their lives who had all three of those and weren't happy. As I suspect people in this room may know folks like that in your life as well. Yet, they worried if they stepped off that train, they would be left behind. They told me time and time again, if everyone is going that direction, we don't want to get left behind. We've got to keep up with that rat race. And that's just what they did. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong, by the way, with fame, wealth, or power. There's nothing inherently wrong with any of them. But on their own, they rarely bring lasting fulfillment. They have to be built on top of that triad of fulfillment: relationship, service, and purpose. So fundamentally, if we want to address the deeper roots of unhappiness, we need a clear and explicit shift in society that puts relationships and purpose and service back at the center of our lives. By the way, this wisdom is not new. Many of you will recognize it from Scripture. You'll recognize it for perhaps reflections on your own life when you've thought about the moments when you felt most deeply fulfilled. There was often a person involved, maybe an act of service that you were providing where you felt useful. Maybe you felt like your life had a real sense of purpose that was bigger than yourself. Now, Nicholas's work, which we're going to hear about more today, is a reminder of this deeper need that we have to connect with something bigger than ourselves. Yo-Yo's work as an extraordinary and renowned musician reminds us of the power of art to catalyze human connection. The parting prescription I mentioned earlier that I wrote at the end of my term was intended to lay out a path to rebuilding community and re-anchoring our lives in that triad of fulfillment. And here is my challenge to all of us. Can we make community the lens through which we look at our life and our work? Can we have community be the compass that we use to make decisions about what we prioritize and about where we invest our time and attention? And in this effort, small steps make a big difference. If we do one small thing each day to help someone, well, that is how we serve. If we reach out to one friend each day just to check on them, well, that is how we nurture relationships. If we talk to our friends and our children more openly and honestly about how we find purpose in our lives that's rooted in contributing to the lives of others, well, that is how we cultivate purpose. When we take these steps, something else extraordinary happens, which is that we start to feel a greater sense of meaning and belonging in our life. And the more of us feel this way, the more we can make higher order changes. The more we can start gathering our friends around food, around activities, around faith, around service. The more likely we are to design our workplaces and our schools to foster social connection. The more likely we are to choose leaders who lead with kindness and generosity and service in their hearts and support policies that reflect these deeper values as well. I want to say that the arts have an especially important role here. one that I worry as a country we may have lost sight of, even though there are visionaries like Alice and Yo-Yo Ma who have never lost sight of that. But there is this false distinction that has been drawn over the years between science and the arts. This idea that there are two different fields, two different interests, competing, in fact. But the arts allow us to learn about ourselves. They allow us to gather together. They help us heal. And I have seen this firsthand in my work as a doctor, in my own life training to become a doctor. One of my first experiences in medical school was going to the British Art Museum, because we came to understand that it was by studying paintings that we actually became better, interestingly, at identifying abnormalities on X-rays and CAT scans. And studies actually demonstrated that. I was part of one of those studies as a student. When I, a few years later, became a medical resident, I found myself working really hard, doing work that I loved, but it was emotionally challenging work, taking care of people who were seriously ill, losing patients, often patients who were even my own age. I was in my mid-20s at that time. And where I found healing was actually, surprisingly to me, in dance. I walked by this studio, dance studio, every day on the way home. And unlike most studios which made you sign up for 8 weeks of classes, this one had drop-in classes, which was perfect for a medical resident who was on call every third or fourth night and didn't have a consistent schedule, right? So I started taking salsa classes. And I loved them. And I found that it was those classes that helped me get out of my head and into my body and feel grounded. And I would come to work the next day feeling energized and ready to go to work. These are just a few of the examples that so many of us have had about how art can enrich our lives. But to put all of this in perspective, I live just maybe a mile or two from the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And I walk by there, I run by there at times, and I think about the extraordinary things that have happened around that memorial over the years. Perhaps no event reaches out more to me and is sort of seared into my memory more than what happened there 62 years ago, when Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial at the famous March on Washington. And in that march, he asked us a question as a country that is still relevant today. He asked, what kind of nation do we want to be? And that's what I find myself thinking about. That remains the question that confronts us today. What kind of nation do we want to be? Do we choose the status quo, where millions of people are struggling with pain and isolation and despair? Or do we choose to be a nation where we have each other's backs, where we recognize that human connection and community are our superpowers? Do we choose the path of health and happiness and fulfillment? These are the defining questions that we, all of us, are now called to answer. I know that I want us to be a nation that leads with love and not fear, because to build community requires love. Love not as sentimentality, but as a commanding force with the power to build, strengthen, and heal. Love as generosity and kindness. Love as hope and grace. Love as courage and commitment. The truth is that America and the world need a new generation of community builders. A generation that's not defined by age, but by spirit, by a fierce and unyielding commitment to each other. A generation that's willing to stand up and reject the pessimism and animosity of our times, and instead choose courage and hope. And I believe that we must be that generation. Whenever I start to lose hope, whenever I feel the tentacles of pessimism creeping into my spirit, I try to think about the patients that I cared for in the final days of their lives, the patients I was lucky enough to sit by and hold their hand and listen to their stories in those final days. And I think about what they talked about as they reflected on what made for a good life. You know what they never talked about? They never talked about the size of their bank accounts or the number of followers they had on social media. They never talked about their list of achievements. What they always talked about were people. The people they loved, the people they served, the people whose lives they touched. In the end, when only the most meaningful strands of life remain, this is what matters. And if you ever forget this, I'll leave you with a 20-second practice that you can call on during these moments when you may feel alone or despondent. I'll ask all of you just to raise your right hand and to place it on your heart and to close your eyes. Think about the people in your life who have been there for you over the years. Your family, your friends, your cherished mentors, the people who have been with you to celebrate your moments of joy and who have showed up during times of pain and disappointment, the people who stood by you even when you lost faith in yourself and who quietly reminded you of who you are. Feel their love flowing through you, strengthening you, guiding you, and filling you with peace. Know that you are deserving of this love. And know that love is always there for you, whether they are with you or not, because it resides in your heart. Now open your eyes. What you felt in those few seconds, that is the power of love. As a doctor, I've prescribed many medicines over the years, but I know that love is the world's oldest and most powerful medicine. Our ability to give and receive love is our greatest blessing and our greatest power. It is our greatest source of healing. And it is what will sustain all of us on this journey to create a world with more community, with more fulfillment, and with more joy. To take us on this next step of this journey toward fulfillment, community, and joy, it is truly my honor to introduce Nicholas Ma. Nicholas is a director, a writer, a producer, but he is so much more than that. He is a man who, when you meet him, you feel his empathy, you feel his kindness. He listens with a full heart and an open ear, and he tells stories brilliantly and beautifully. Nicholas is a man of the world. He has traveled and worked in Shanghai, in Beirut, in New York, in Washington, D.C., all over. And he has brought those stories and those experiences together and helped identify the common threads of humanity that bring us together, the threads that we are now called to strengthen and to repair. So with no further ado, let me call up Nicholas Ma. Nicholas, over to you.
So, midway through shooting my last film, I found myself in the sticks of Michigan. I was halfway between Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids. It was actually quite beautiful. The snow was coming down in buckets, and it had transformed these Adirondack chairs into these chubby Michelin men. It was also a little bit foreboding. Outside of the sort of sliding glass doors of my sort of ground floor room were these neon floodlights that never went off. They just sort of flickered constantly. And as a documentarian, I'm always asking myself this question: what story is this? What story am I in? And that morning I remember thinking, I don't know if this is the end of a white Christmas or the beginning of The Shining. It was disconcerting. And it only got stranger, because 2 hours later, I found myself in the living room of one of the cottages at the inn, surrounded by a dozen Christian pastors. It was December, and they were singing an Easter hymn, Jesus Christ is risen today. They were led by a Methodist pastor, accompanied on guitar by a Bible church pastor. It was surreal. But that's kind of the amazing thing about being a documentarian. You're always looking for those moments that you're like, I've never seen that on film. I don't know what's going to happen there. And that's what it was. And so I hung in, and that footage became the film Leap of Faith, a film we took to cities and communities around the country last year, and which we're screening here tomorrow night. Only when we started taking this film to audiences did I realize that this story sits within a much bigger story. And I have to say, Vivek, you touched on this story so beautifully, and I'm so grateful, because I couldn't articulate it with nearly the same grace. But I want to add a couple points. We're living in this moment right now of maximal awareness. All 8.2 billion of us on this planet. We're more aware of each other. We know more about each other. We know more about each other's joys and sorrows than ever before in human history. And we're more able to connect to each other than ever before in human history. And that sounds like a good thing. But it's also made us lonelier. It's a strange fact, because when we feel like we can connect to everyone, we also realize just how inescapably, mind-bendingly small we actually are. And so we surround ourselves with people who are like us in order to feel seen, to feel bigger. It's a natural impulse. And we keep doing that, but those relationships are fragile. Because if I love you because you're the same as me, and you love me because I'm the same as you, what happens if you change or discover you're different? Or what happens if I do? What happens to that relationship? So these relationships that seem to keep us safe and can from the outside seem monolithic are incredibly fragile and lonely-making, and they've led us to some really sad outcomes. The one that just sticks in my mind is that 46% of us in this country feel like we're strangers in our own country. That's not along party lines. That's true in communities across the country. Almost half of us feel like strangers in our own country. And it's made us angry. We have a real conviction that we matter and a growing fear that we don't. It's made us worried because we still have this real desire to help, but we have this growing cynicism that perhaps our help is irrelevant. And it's made us sad. The world is bigger than ever before. Our problems are bigger than ever before. Our awareness of our problems is bigger than ever before. And yet our responsibility and influence as a species is bigger than ever before. So you might now be thinking, what does that have to do with 12 singing pastors in Michigan? I promise these two stories aren't just related, they're actually inextricably intertwined. My journey to this chorus of pastors in Michigan started in 2016. It's 9 years ago now, so maybe I can bring you back. 2016, we're in the midst of a heated election. Both sides saw each other as inhuman, saw the contest as existential. I know it might be hard to get to that space, but that's where we were in 2016. I got this call from Morgan Neville, the extraordinary documentarian and filmmaker and very dear friend. He said, I have a crazy idea. What if we were to make a documentary about a Presbyterian pastor named Fred Rogers? And it clicked in my head. This is that Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, right? The man who pioneered children's television alongside Sesame Street, who taught generations of American children to see strength and kindness. It was 2016. I thought we needed that message. I said, absolutely yes, I'm on board. I had actually made a crazy decision a few years back to walk away from a decade of working at the biggest institutions, the institutions where we're told where we can make the biggest difference. Naturally, I started my career at McKinsey & Company, the once celebrated and now benighted consulting firm. I don't know what its tagline was back then, but I can tell you what it is today. Pinpointing the strategy for reshaping tomorrow. I mean, that is some heady stuff, right? I worked for Mayor Bloomberg in New York, I worked for the UN in Beirut, I worked for Teddy Kennedy and John Kerry in the US Senate, and I think if you've looked at Lebanon, if you've looked at McKinsey, if you've looked at the US Senate, you're not surprised that I didn't feel like I was making the kind of difference that I wanted. So I stepped away from that work and I said, I want to meet people where they are, I want to tell stories that resonate, and that brings me back to Morgan Calling and that question about Fred. It was perfect. Here was a man who had pioneered the media as a force for good. And the movie landed. All across the country, people were talking about Won't You Be My Neighbor? They were saying, here's a movie that touched me. I needed to hear this message. I needed it now. I didn't know how much I needed it. I'm so grateful. And they'd always come back to one line, which was, look for the helpers. Now, my very wise mother is in the audience tonight. And it should be noted that Fred wasn't the one who said, look for the helpers. He was quoting his very wise mother, who said, look for the helpers. There are always people who are helping. So brief shout out to the wise mothers in the audience. Your work is not in vain. It is greatly, greatly appreciated. So look for the helpers. We had brought this film into the world. It had broken all sorts of box office records. People were talking about it. Here we were the helpers. And then it's 2020. And we're in the midst of a heated election. Both sides saw each other as intolerable, and humans saw the contest as existential. And it was hard not to ask myself, had we actually helped? Had we made a difference? Fred was still dead, and there didn't seem to be a whole legion of new Fred Rogers trying to do work in this space. It was pretty disheartening. And it was in that moment that I came across Michael Gulker. First in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, and then over Zoom, and he's here with us in the audience tonight. Michael was also a pastor from the Midwest, ran something called the Colossian Forum, and his goal was to heal congregations. And being a pretty brave man, he would choose the real doozies of topics. You know, we're talking young earth creationism and evolution. We're talking contemporary and biblical sexuality. We're talking tribal politics. He would take them all on. But his goal wasn't to resolve the conflict. His goal was to help us to see the image of God in each other. That was the same idea behind Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Not just the same idea, the same scripture, the same impulse that drove Fred. And when Michael said he wanted to do something bigger, I said, I'm absolutely on board. Here's the answer, right? He had this audacious goal, this earnest desire to test something so profound. I wanted to make a sequel to Won't You Be My Neighbor, something that could serve as an answer to those questions that movie left, something that could be a microcosm or maybe even a roadmap for the challenges that we faced as a country. He proposed bringing 12 pastors together from across the theological spectrum to see if Christianity was powerful enough to hold them together. He wanted to go beyond a congregation and work across a city that had been riven by violence and racial divisions. He wanted to go beyond denominations and see if he could begin to heal Christianity, a faith which in this country was splintering around questions of human sexuality and its role in politics. It was big, and I was excited. I was looking for another documentary subject. I had found it, and that brought me to the shores of Gun Lake and this chorus of pastors. So spoiler alert for those of you who are coming back tomorrow, they did not heal Grand Rapids or heal Christianity. And midway through the filming, Michael had become pretty despondent. He had begun by evangelizing this idea that love of God and love of neighbor was our path through everything, the thorniest of issues, from COVID to critical race theory. But midway through filming, that question had turned to something different. What difference does a little more love of God and love of neighbor make when the world is on fire? What difference does a little more love of God and love of neighbor make when the world is on fire? Thankfully, that's not where the movie ends. But it's a really important question, and I want to sit with it for a second. Because Michael's question was my question. What difference had a little bit of Fred made? What difference had my work in New York or Beirut or Grand Rapids made? And I think in these lonely and polarized times, when we feel so small in this big world, it's the question that all of us, fundamentally, are asking. Now, here's part of the answer. I think we're trading hard problems for impossible ones, right? As the challenges that we face as a world grow in their enormity, we sometimes think that the solutions need to grow in their enormity too, right? And that creates a terrible, terrible feedback loop. We go from look for the helpers to be the heroes, because anything else doesn't make a difference. We have to solve problems of epic proportions. But being a hero is a sure recipe for disappointment, and it certainly was for me. It's why I had walked away from that world. It's what drives so many of us who go into public service to say, hey, we can make change, we're going to drive change from the top down, and when that doesn't happen, we become disillusioned. And in that moment of disillusionment, for me, I returned to the two things that I loved when I was a child: theater and physics. Art and science. I was a nerdy child, so art and science. And just beyond them, faith. Art, science, and faith. I think so often they seem like competing doctrines, but they actually share something profound in common. They're the only things that endure. Right? If you think about it, throughout the history of humanity across millennia, the only things that we still have are art, science, and faith. Go back 100 years, there are lots of things. Go back 1,000 years, 2,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. That's all that remains. I think a lot about that word enduring right now, in part because it doesn't feel very inspiring, maybe because the things that we have to endure don't often feel very noble. We have to endure headlines or tweets we don't like. We have to endure colleagues we may like even less. I have to endure the cries of a 1-year-old child who just doesn't feel good. I wonder if we can change that story around and think about endurance not as a trial, something where we feel helpless, but rather something that is filled with possibility. Have a look at this little guy. He's 5,000 years old. He's a tiny man, eyes wide open, on his way somewhere. We don't know who it is. We don't know why it was made. We don't know the artist who made it. The one thing we can be certain of is that whoever made this has no idea that 5,000 years later, 5,000 miles away, he's sitting in a little glass box in a thing called a museum in a place called Chicago. Nor could he know that I wanted to take a photograph of it and share it with you here in Bentonville. I first saw it right before I decided to say yes to this film, and I felt compelled to take a picture of it, partially as this reminder that art endures, and partially as a reminder that artists can't know their outcomes. Art endures, certainly, but which art will endure? It's impossible to know. The path is so circuitous, so unpredictable. Maybe what you create will be hailed immediately. Maybe it will be discovered after your death. Maybe it will take on some unforeseen significance 5,000 years in the future. Now, we may not all be artists, but we all have works of art like this in our lives that have shaped us. A song you danced to at your wedding, a book you read as a child, a film you turned to in times of grief. And we know in the moments that we turn to those works of art that whoever created it has no idea the significance that it's playing for us right now. It is a gift that is given to us by someone who does not know our name, does not know our circumstances, cannot know any of that. In these loneliest of moments, art reaches out in its wild improbability and connects us with the strangeness and beauty of our shared humanity. I'd like to share with you one other work of art. This is a piece of music. It's called Appalachia Waltz. Now, in the fiddling tradition in Appalachia goes back to the 18th century. The waltz tradition in Europe goes back to the 16th century, but the piece itself was composed in the 20th century. I'm curious as you listen to it what you hear. We also have a very special guest to play it tonight. This guest is an incomparable father, a doting grandfather, and a pretty darn good cellist. Please welcome Yo-Yo Ma.
You have me in tears. You have me in tears.
I promise that's not the last we're going to hear from that guy. I do wonder what people will hear in the 22nd century. We've all had this moment together, and each of us has heard something different. It's a shared experience, and yet each of us brings to it part of who we are. I wonder whether in the 22nd century someone will hear what you heard or what you heard. Maybe Appalachia Waltz will have disappeared. Maybe it will have taken on some yet unforeseen context. We can't know. I want to step from the world of the arts to the world of science, and I promise no physics or math is required. This story is from the world of penguins. It's negative 40 degrees in the Antarctic. It's too cold for me, and it's actually too cold for penguins. But somehow they survive, and they endure. How do they do it? Well, the first thing is they huddle. They come together to generate warmth. And it turns out it's too effective. At the center of those huddles, it's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, much too hot for penguins. Worse yet, they're so tightly packed at that point that they can't even move. But somehow the huddle knows to rotate penguins from the outside to the inside and from the inside out. It's kind of a marvel. You would think with such a complex problem, you would need a really complex solution. Maybe you need some penguin foreman, or maybe you need a vast penguin socialist bureaucracy that's redistributing warmth. It turns out that's not how they do it. They have a simple rule, which is when they join the huddle, they measure the temperature of their left and their right wing, and they tuck into the place where they can maximize that temperature differential. That simple rule keeps the heat inside the huddle and keeps the penguins moving. Now, you might be tempted to say, aha, we should herald the libertarian ethos of the penguins. Each penguin for their penguin selves. But that's actually not quite right either, because there's a second rule, and this is important. There's a moment where the penguin in front of you goes to tuck in somewhere else, and you're there standing, bearing the full brunt of the Antarctic chill. And you have to make a choice. What are you going to do? I can tell you what the penguins do, which is they endure it for as long as they can before they tuck in someplace else. It's actually a pretty beautiful thing to endure that cold for just as long as they can before tucking in someplace else. It's a metaphor. I mean, we all know this. But I think it's an important metaphor. We talk about discomfort as something that should be avoided. And I wonder if we can turn that into something that we embrace. What would it mean to embrace discomfort as a gift for the people behind you? A gift of warmth, a gift of safety, a gift of fortitude, a gift of love. We need metaphors. Unlike penguins, we can't rely on our instincts. We're given this gift of consciousness, and we have to make these choices actively every day. I think it's also interesting that we can take stories from antiquities, we can take music from the 20th century, and we can take penguins from the South Pole, and we can find stories that are all pointing towards the same answer. The beauty of endurance in cold, over time, the power of a single action that can endure and extend. And that brings me back to faith. I think that faith is an inescapable part of the human condition. Now, some of us put faith in the power of the arts. Some of us put faith in the scientific process. Some of us put faith in a specific religion or doctrine. And some of us are visionaries like Vivek and like Alice, who recognize that all three are articulations of faith in a belief in something, and that they reveal the beauty of the shared capacity that we all have for a deep and abiding faith. Now, I think it's really hard to trust something that sounds simple, but I also think it's really easy to underestimate something like this shared capacity. My sister-in-law, Jackie, used to live in California, and she'd make these little Ziploc bags where she'd have granola bars and a pair of socks and some shelter information, and she'd tuck them into the front seat of her car. And any time she would drive past someone who was living on the street, she'd offer them a bag. And it made a difference, albeit a small one, to each person that she interacted with. What she couldn't know at the time was it also made a difference to my husband, who was inspired to do the same thing in New York. What she couldn't know at the time is it also made a difference to me. It's made me a better dad because I can say to my daughter, there's always a way in which we can help, and we never need to overlook the need that exists around us. And it's also made a difference to our relationship, hers and mine, so that 10 years later, as she and I stand sharply and deeply divided over politics, that division in my heart is tempered by gratitude. She couldn't know any of that when she was handing out those bags. All she could do was engage with the person she was handing a bag to, and as a person of faith, hope that that act might ripple out in some unexpected way. And here's what's beautiful. This is actually the same as my father when he plays. He's playing to one specific person in the audience, in the belief that making that connection feel real, will ripple out to everyone else who is listening. And it's the same thing that Fred did. He wouldn't speak to the camera, he would speak to a single child, and in doing so, he would touch more deeply the millions of children who were listening. And it's also what these pastors discovered in their time together in Michigan and taught me. Such different people, all making the same choice, to focus on a single relationship, a single offering of help, in the belief that it might mean much, much more. Now, Vivek and I did not coordinate our remarks, but I would also like to leave you with a challenge, and it's a similar one to his. Fred said, love is at the root of all things, all learning, all parenting, all relationships, love or the lack of it. And this is a love challenge. We all have 3 people in our lives that we struggle to love well. 3 people we want to love better today than we did yesterday. 3 people that we can love better tomorrow than we did today. Think about who they are. Maybe it's a friend that you haven't spoken to in a long time out of fear that that love won't be reciprocated. Maybe it's a parent or sibling or child whose politics enrage you. Maybe it's a colleague with whom your patience is just simply worn thin. Think about them for a moment. Imagine them in your mind, and imagine what might happen if you offered them a little more love without expectation. Imagine that. We may not leave here and make a sculpture that will last for 5,000 years. We may not leave here and make a scientific discovery that will upend our understanding of the universe, but we can all love better. And it is the same kind of act that endures and ricochets and builds. It's a transformative gift that is given freely with no knowledge of what it will do and no ceiling on what it might do. Now imagine if all of us were to make that same choice now. If as a country, as a chorus, we were to revel in our shared capacity for faith and to choose a more radical kind of love, even if only to 3 people we struggle to love well. It would mean 1 billion more relationships of love. And that is the beautiful uncertainty of love and the terrifying uncertainty of love to those who oppose it. It is this dense fabric that emerges whole cloth to hold us together. It is a choice that is always ours, that cannot be taken away from us. So I say, let's do it. Let's make that choice. Let's have faith in the extraordinary possibility that it offers. For me, it began in a room of 12 pastors who found a way to love each other and then to love me. And some of those pastors and I are now in a room with you of hundreds of people. And I have faith that we can make the same choice. I have faith in our endurance as we try. In darkness, I have faith in love. In conflict, I have faith in you and me. And today, I have an extraordinary and unshakable faith in us. Thank you. That's very kind, but I don't want to cut into what will come next. There is a man here who has had an unshakable faith in me throughout my life and who has had an unshakable faith in the world. I want to welcome back my father, who manages to say everything I would want to say simply with his instrument, the incomparable Yo-Yo Ma.
I'm no penguin. But sometimes I wear penguin outfits. I'm going to play for you the music of someone who's helped me since I was a child. I don't have 12 pastors, but I have 6 movements that, to me, represent head, heart, and body through dances that come from everywhere that this musician knew of in his time. And like Nicholas said, this man didn't really know who he was writing for. But I know this music has helped me, and I hope in times of joy or sorrow or whatever state you're in, that you might find some connection to this music, even though it's a message from the past. And in the same spirit of endurance, I hope, the mic actually works. In the spirit of endurance, I hope this music will live in you in some way that you could find useful. Bach Suite Number 1.
It is now my pleasure to welcome Ms. Alfre Woodard, who will conclude the evening by moderating a discussion with Nicholas and Vivek. Alfre Woodard is an acclaimed actor and producer known for her powerful performances across film and television. She earned an Academy Award nomination for Cross Creek and a BAFTA nomination for Clemency. Her diverse body of work includes 12 Years a Slave, Mandela, Grand Canyon, Passion Fish, Miss Evers' Boys, earning Emmy, SAG, and Golden Globe wins, Crooklyn, Love and Basketball, The Family That Prays, and Down in the Delta. On TV, she starred in Desperate Housewives and True Blood, and won an NAACP Image Award for her role in Steel Magnolias. Beyond acting, Ms. Woodard is a dedicated activist and humanitarian. For over 25 years, she has championed human rights, democracy, and the fight against HIV/AIDS in South Africa. In 2009, President Barack Obama appointed her to the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities, where she helped launch the Turnaround Arts Initiative to improve student engagement nationwide. Please join me in welcoming Alfre Woodard.
Thank you. Am I good? Hi. I don't know about you, but I feel so rich. I feel incredibly rich today. Thank you, Vivek. Thank you, Nicholas. And I worship at the temple of Yo-Yo in the best way. Okay, so good evening, everybody. And yes, it is a good evening because we are in it together. Especially in this time, I am moved at how beautiful you all look together. You know, everybody eats rice. You know, they put different flavors on it. Some people with just some fish, some people vegetables, everything. Some people roll it in balls, make patties out of it, but everybody eats rice. And that's something that I think of when I see you all together. I am tremendously grateful to you, Nicholas, for bringing me into this circle, bringing us into community, into healing, and giving us the possibility of joy. You've been called to be a storyteller, my young brother, and you honor that call with purified motives that lifts us up into the understanding that the sun has no favorite children, and there's nothing we can do about it. She shines on all of us equally. A great truth is, as has been said in many ways tonight, we are inextricably connected on this planet, and the more we celebrate that, the more we embrace that, the more beauty, the more balance, the more peace we experience in our everydays. So that's our birthright. Let's claim it. Now, would you guys come up? Come on up. And have it. Choose your seats. Yeah, how fortunate am I to be able to sit with these visionaries.
How fortunate are we to sit with you?
Absolutely.
I mean,
Oh, what is it, $10 and a box of popcorn? You can always sit with me. Or at home for whatever the subscription is. Okay, so I'm going to toss out a question to you, and you know, answer it any way you feel moved, and yes, talk to each other if you want. This is going to be like a mom's Sunday dinner table kind of vibe. So, you know, at the end, we'll have a little space for all the cousins and uncles and aunties. Maybe somebody wants to ask you a question. So let's get going. Nicholas, being the fully realized storyteller you are, I hear you venturing far beyond on this engaging film. You're speaking of art and science appropriately within the same rhapsody. What does the next phase of the project look like, and where and to whom will you be taking this broader, higher leap?
oh my gosh. I should probably have a really good answer to that. No, I mean, I think we sometimes forget that while our starting places are all very different, the destination is the same. And I don't mean death, I mean sort of this desire for connection and love. And I think that by being able to talk about these different starting points, whether they're art or science or faith, to be able to recognize them and to honor them each as having value, as having meaning, I think allows us to sort of relax into seeing that common destination that we also share. Our hope is to bring that message to anyone that's willing to listen, to say, how can we find more rooms like this of people who have the courage to say, I may be uncomfortable with science, or I may be uncomfortable with faith, or I may be uncomfortable with the arts, but I really want that thing at the center, and I'm curious about it, and I'm curious about the people that stand around that circle with me.
Okay. Vivek, you are so many things. You would be a bonanza at career day. So many things, and yet you're the gold standard in each one of them. A researcher, a civil servant, a cookbook author. Very impressive. How early did you discover being drawn to seemingly disparate arenas, and what keeps you pushing further afield?
Alfre, that's very kind of you. I was always the oddball growing up. I never felt like I quite fit with one particular path. I wanted to be a doctor because I saw what my parents were doing, running a medical clinic in Miami when I was growing up. But I didn't understand much about the science as a young kid. What I saw was the healing, the relationships. I saw people coming in looking anxious and worried, and then leaving feeling a little bit more at ease, knowing they had a partner in their healing. And there's something about that magic that made me say, I'd like to be a part of that. Even in medicine, I never quite fit in. I had a residency program director toward the end of my training who would meet with all of the residents to say, have you figured out what you want to do yet? And I was the problem child. Because I wouldn't give him the answer that he hoped for, which was something like, oh, I discovered that I'm really interested in G protein signaling and cardiac myocytes. I want to be a researcher. Instead, I would say things like this. I would say, I don't know yet, but I want to work with a small group of people who desperately want to improve the lives of others at scale, who share a core set of values, and I want to make magic together with them. And he would say, what am I supposed to do with you? But for that reason, I have always felt a bit like the oddball. So my path has been quite varied. It's taken me from medicine to building a technology company to doing advocacy and building grassroots organizations and to writing and all of this. And throughout all of it, my mentors would tell me, your resume just doesn't make sense. There's no narrative here. You're not going to make sense to anybody who is trying to hire you. But ironically, the one job where all of the crazy disparate things that I did actually did become useful and made sense was when I was nominated to serve as Surgeon General. Because it turns out that it was a job where I needed to understand medicine, but where I wanted to build public health campaigns, which meant you needed to understand how to mobilize people and build a grassroots effort. Some of our campaigns involved technology. Our very first campaign on the opioid epidemic involved building a site for doctors and dentists and nurse practitioners to help them change their prescribing practices. And I found that I drew on a lot of the skills that I had to build as a technology startup entrepreneur, where I was believe it or not, the user interface and design person because there was nobody else, not because I was qualified. But I used those skills like in the office. And then the arts came together as well, because during the COVID pandemic, it became very clear to me from very early on that the wound that we were suffering because of COVID couldn't just be measured solely by the number of people who were hospitalized or the number of diagnoses, but there was a deeper wound that we were feeling in our hearts and our spirits, not being able to be together, worrying about loved ones getting ill, actually losing our loved ones. And my feeling was that to help address that, we would need more than words, but we would need art. And it was for that reason, actually, that in 2023, we put together, my team and I, a concert at the Kennedy Center called Songs for Hope, which brought together artists and musicians to take us through an arc from grief and loss to connection and community to love and healing, the arc that many of us had to go through during this pandemic. So all that just to say that I'm 47 years old, I'm still trying to figure out what to do when I grow up. But what I have achieved now, which I didn't earlier in my life, was a comfort with discomfort, a comfort with not knowing what the next step will be, and a faith that the universe will guide me there. And if I listen to myself, if I listen for that voice of inspiration that says, this excites me, this would make me want to get up in the morning, then that's the only voice that I really need to keep as my true north. So.
We've heard the word faith, we've heard the word hope this afternoon. And I think we would agree that those are action words. And I know there's people who are moved, who want to step up, step out, do something. What action would you say to someone to take in their communities? All the communities are different. You have to read it and know it. But how do you make those actions? Ignite the actions, both of you.
I do come back to this question of people you struggle to love, because I just think it is so, like, at least for me, I can immediately think of who those people are in my life. You know who you are. And I think that, you talked about those everyday things and seeing the value in them and realizing that they have this impact beyond what we can necessarily immediately sense or measure. And to me, that's what comes from loving someone that you struggle to love, right? It sort of builds this muscle that reminds you can, right? Because I think when we retreat from that, we actually reinforce the notion that we can't. And then it just limits the possibilities. And I think, as you said, like, to find a small group of people who are loving the same thing, you want those people to be different from you, right? Different in some way, different in a way that you struggle with, that makes you think. And if you can find them, new possibilities emerge. And I think, to your point, then all of a sudden, you'll know what the right next step is. You'll know. I have faith that you will know. You try to love someone a little bit better, and they say to you, okay, well, here's the problem that I'm facing. Well, it's then very clear in that moment what you can do to be helpful. I think to offer, some blanket prescription of what you all should do in your communities, I worry that what happens is then it rings false. And I think the question is, how do we find that little voice inside us that's telling us, okay, here's something I can do. I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to do this. And then I'm going to do the next thing. And each time I do that, I gain confidence that I can take action and I have power over the world around me. I often think to myself that on the worst day, when things are not going right in the world beyond my immediate circle, my happiness is still much more predicated on whether my daughter is feeling well or not, right? And her happiness is much more predicated on whether I'm being a good dad or not. And so to not see those actions as being, table stakes, but actually the fabric that ultimately allows for those bigger actions that transform the world.
Yeah, just to build on what Nicholas is saying, and there's so much wisdom there, and I for those of you who are hopefully going to be watching the film tomorrow, this screening, it is so full of deep wisdom and nuggets and pearls which are actually within our grasp and which we can use to make decisions perhaps about how we live our lives. So I want to build on what you were saying, though. I think that at the root cause, or at the root of so much of the healing that we've been talking about tonight, is this word love, that Nicholas has talked about, that I've spoken about, Alfre, you've mentioned as well. And I think we have to broaden, how we think about the concept of love. I think that the world around us has increasingly made us think about love as something perhaps sappy, as only romantic love, as something that's sentimental, or worst of all, as something that makes us weak. And I hear this actually from young boys all the time. It's very interesting, actually, the science around how young boys talk about friendships. Because when boys are very young, they'll actually talk about friendships very similar to how girls talk about friendships, young girls. They'll say, oh, I can't wait to spend time with my friend. I really miss my friend. I love my friend. I can't wait to hang out. But as young boys get older, something in society teaches them that, hey, you don't use that L word anymore. That's going to make you a sissy. You don't talk about missing your friend, needing your friend. That a real man doesn't need other people. They're self-sufficient. They don't show emotion. The only problem with that is that's contrary to what it means to be human, right? Because all human beings, regardless of their gender, they feel things. They need each other. We are an interdependent species. And so I do think what's important for us is to expand the lens through which we look at the concept of love, and realize that an act of kindness is an act of love, an act of service is an act of love, an act of listening is an act of love. And I say that and underscore that because we live in such an action-oriented world that sometimes listening feels passive and not useful. But something I was taught early on in medical school was that there are going to be times where you don't have the answer, the diagnosis. There are going to be times when you don't have the cure, the medicine. But you can still help heal with your presence, by listening, by showing up. When we listen to somebody else, that reminds them that they matter. It doesn't require us to fix their problems. It doesn't require us to overtalk things, to share our own stories. Listening reminds people that they matter. So I think as we go back to our lives and think, how can I live better, a life that's more fulfilling for me? How can I help create more fulfillment in the lives of others? I think thinking about the question of how can I embark on one simple act of love each day in a way that makes sense to me? How could I be kind to the colleague at work who's having a tough time? How could I be generous when a stranger needs help, whether it's directions or help picking up the groceries that they spilled in the store? How can I be there as a shoulder to lean on or an ear to listen to my friend or my spouse or my child who's having a hard time? These are the acts of love that enrich our lives, and it is in the giving and receiving of love that we find our deepest and most powerful healing.
I want to now build on what you're saying. Sorry, if that's okay.
No, this
Okay.
is the Sunday table.
This works. Okay.
Yeah.
No, because I think you're saying.
You asked Mom for permission.
I mean, I
Go ahead, darling. Go ahead and talk.
No, I think that there is. We often think that you're loving someone into changing, right? And I don't think that's what loving means, right? Loving someone is an offering to them that gives the choice of change to them. It's not yours, right? I think we sometimes want to love someone out of sadness, right? Or we want to love someone into a different position, or we want to love someone into loving us, you know? And I think that part of what love is, you know, as Michael would say, it's this sort of self-giving love where you don't get to control the outcome. Yeah. You don't get to control the outcome. And I think that's, you know, when you talk about how do we reframe love, it's that. To offer that to someone else is a really hard thing to do because you are incredibly vulnerable. You're basically giving this thing to somebody else and saying, and you can stomp on it if you want to, right? And that actually, I think, is actually an act of extraordinary strength, not of weakness, because you have to know internally that you can withstand it.
Yeah, and this is the paradox, right? Is that it is an act of strength.
Yeah.
Like nobody would say that a mother who puts herself in harm's way to protect her child from an oncoming car, that mother is weak, right? Nobody would say that a father who rushes to save their child before something drops on their head, that love is weak, right? We recognize that as some of the most powerful love, and a source of strength rather, that we have. But we are living in a time where love is actually looked at as weak. So we have to reframe love, I think. And in particular, we have to change and model for our kids a different way of considering love. Because if we can help them see love as a source of strength, there's extraordinary ripples that come from that. Because it doesn't just affect their life. It affects the kind of workplace that they'll contribute to when they grow up. It affects the way that they'll teach kids in a classroom when they become an educator. It affects the kind of leaders we choose, right? And that really matters too. You know, I was with a group of mayors. I spent a lot of time with mayors at Surgeon General. And what's so striking to me is mayors get this, a lot of them. They understand, because they're on the front lines, that leading with love is actually not weakness, but that's strong leadership, right? And I had a good friend, a mayor who became a good friend, Tom Tate from Anaheim, California, who ran on a platform of making Anaheim a city of kindness, right? Because he believed love was the most important thing, and kindness was one of the most powerful manifestations of love. Now, I gotta admit to you, before he ran, he thought he was gonna be laughed off the stage. He thought, people are gonna think this is hokey. But when he got up and he made his speech, he saw a lot of heads nodding. Like, yeah, I do want our city to be kinder. I do think we have it in us, but we're not showing it enough. And then when he got elected mayor, he went to his team and he said, we gotta really do this, and that means what would a kind policy be for people who are struggling with opioid addiction? And he realized, and his team realized, a kind policy would be not shaming and blaming them, but connecting them to help, recognizing that they were struggling with an addiction, just like to alcohol or any other substance. They recognized that in school, that they needed to teach kids about kindness. So they began a Million Acts of Kindness program, where schools worked together to figure out how many acts of kindness they could do. And even among neighbors, right? They recognized a really interesting thing, which is that reaching out and getting to know your neighbors was not just good for your relationships and your sense of community, it was good for your safety. Because when he worked with the police in Anaheim, they realized that when criminals were casing the neighborhoods, they tended to know when neighbors knew each other, when they were looking out for each other's properties, and when they didn't. And so there was quite literally safety in numbers. So I think we have to consider love as not just a source of strength, but also as a way of life that we have to cultivate, as a compass that helps us point in the right direction when we're making decisions on our life. And I often find myself asking myself, when I'm in a hard situation, when I'm really upset with somebody, when I'm really disappointed at something, what would love do in this circumstance? Not what did they deserve, what should I do, what can I get away with? Not that, but what would love do? And I usually find when I listen to the answer to that question and follow it, I'm usually much better off than when I respond motivated by something else.
I think we might be ready to ask the cousins and the uncles if they have, who has the mic, and there's somebody that knows all this. Otherwise, we'll keep talking.
As we're waiting, I will say, I think part of the challenge is that we're living in this moment where our separation politically is actually almost like a full cultural separation, and both sides adopt the word love in different ways that are convenient to them, right? And so this imperative to love either is, if it's coming from someone within your group, I think it is comforting and it feels like, oh, right, this is what we all do, this is who we are. And if it's coming from outside of your group, it sounds like a criticism. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you should be more like me. And I think that to me is always this challenge of the conversation. It's like, well, how do we think about love in that's why I come back to the people you struggle to love in your life, because as soon as it starts to become about policies, then we start to have a very different kind of debate about how, but when it comes to families and communities and neighbors, it's really not about anything else except this human to human interaction, right? And if we can start there, who knows what will happen, right? I mean, I think that's again why I'm so grateful to these, my singing pastors of Michigan, and I hope that they Von Trapp it at some point, because that would be pretty amazing. But they none of them necessarily changed their positions, but they changed, as Michael would say, their posture, right, towards each other. And in doing that, they found a way to love each other that allowed them to all be who they were too. And I think that's the thing that somehow we've started to feel like is impossible, And I don't think it's impossible. I mean, at least I've seen that it's not impossible, but I've also seen that it's very, very hard. So.
Pardon me, but did you use Von Trapp as a verb?
Coming from a musical family, we often talk about Von Trapping as a verb.
Okay. Well, all right. We have had such a full and flavorful evening with you guys. Thank you so much. We're going to. Can you turn the lights up so we can see you guys? You can see each other before we part ways. Oh, there we are. There we are. So, right now. One of the things that we wish for you is that you can begin right now with this whole love thing is that just look around you, see who's near you, say something, chat, just remember the faces because we're in this moment together.
Yes.
And you've just made history. Thank
You're
you
here.
guys.
Absolutely.
Vivek, thank you, Nicholas, thank you, Alfre. What a special evening. If you haven't made plans yet, please check out the film tomorrow at the Momentary, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you.